All right, this is part 4 of your lecture on the nervous system, and this one is all about the brain. So the brain, like I said in part 1, is part of the central nervous system, or CNS, and it has some very characteristic structures. So if we're looking at the brain here, you have a brain stem. The brain stem is what connects to your spinal cord. Jutting off the brain stem is the cerebellum. Cerebellum is really important for things like movement. Behind, in the back of the head, is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is really important for vision. Down sort of on the side of the brain is called the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is really important for hearing. Sort of top back of the head is the parietal lobe. That is largely sensory. So sensory would be like integrating all different types of senses. And then in the front is called the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is really important for things like decision making. If we were to cut through the middle of the brain and look inside, there are more important structures to see. One of them is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a set of white matter, and the white matter is axons and dendrites. Corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres of the brain together. There are some cases where people have really severe epilepsy, and epilepsy is seizures. And basically what a seizure is electrical activity in the brain. Remember we said that that's how brain information moves down in brain cells, through electrical activity. And so in a seizure you have electrical activity that gets out of control and spreads all over. And some people have really bad seizures where the electrical activity gets really out of control and spreads all the way from one side of the brain to another. And that's what's known as a grand mal seizure. That's a big seizure that causes a lot of problems. And in some cases, this has happened a lot more a long time ago, but they do still do it now. One way to prevent the spread of the seizure from one hemisphere of the brain to another was to cut the corpus callosum. And that basically prevents the communication from one side of the brain to the other. Other important structures on the inside of the brain are the ventricles. So here we have lateral ventricles. Those are the biggest. In the ventricles are something called cerebral spinal fluid, and we're going to talk about that in a second. You can also see a third ventricle right here. There are lots of different functions, areas of the brain that have specific functions, and I did talk about a lot of these before. So we'll start here. This part of the brain I think called the limbic association cortex, and that seems to be really important for motivation and emotion and also memory. Here in this little chunk you have primary auditory cortex, which is really important for hearing. Broca's area, which is right here in the brain, is an important structure for speech formation. And they know a lot of the ways that they know what these areas are important for is by studying people that have some type of brain damage or brain injury. So Broca's area is named for somebody who could hear okay and could communicate through writing, but could not speak, could not put words together. And they had, I don't remember if it was a tumor, it must have been some type of brain tumor in this area. You have in the front of the brain what's called prefrontal association cortex. It's really important for things like impulsivity, decision making, personality. It's actually the last part of the brain that develops. So it's largely thought of as a reason why teenagers can be so impulsive and prone to poor decision making, because their prefrontal cortex is not completely developed yet. It tends to be developed by about the age of 19 or 20. Behind the prefrontal cortex is something called premotor cortex, and that's really important for complex movements, so like dancing. The primary motor cortex, which is the strip right here, is important for voluntary movement. Between that and the primary sensory cortex, you have the central sulcus, which is like a deep groove through the center of the brain. Behind, so we have the primary sensory cortex, which is important for senses. We've got posterior, which is behind parietal cortex, important for visual input, some complex movements. You've got Wernicke's area, which is important for speech, and various different association cortexes that are the site of integration and formation of complex activities. The cerebrum is basically this part of the brain, this colored part here. The cerebral hemispheres function in integration, sensory reception, and motor action. You've got 2 cerebral hemispheres. This is the largest part of the brain. The outer layers of each hemisphere is called the cortex. And the cortex consists of many functional regions like I just showed you. The primary motor cortex, like I said, is important for voluntary movement, is shown here in red. Each region of the motor cortex actually controls a specific body part. Conscious thought stimulates the neurons of the motor cortex to generate an impulse. Okay, so if you're like, I want to walk over here, that stimulates the neurons in your primary motor cortex, which is here in red, and allows you to go and do that. The primary sensory cortex, shown here in blue, receives sensory information all throughout the body and decides where it goes. You have aside from the primary, which is shown here in blue, that receives the somatosensory. And somatosensory is basically where your body is in space. So wherever your limbs are at any current moment is processed by the somatosensory cortex in the blue. Then you have the gustatory information, which is taste, in the red. Olfactory information, which is smell, here in the yellow. Auditory cortex, which is purple, so that's sound. And the visual cortex back here in green. Unconscious functions are housed more internally in the brain. There are 3 main things that correspond with unconscious functions, and those are ones that aren't under your specific control. They happen involuntarily, and that's the cerebellum, the hypothalamus, and the brainstem. They're really important for things like breathing, heartbeat, homeostatic functions, so that's regulating body temperature. All of that happens in the hypothalamus. The cerebellum, which is in red here, controls muscle synergy, so that's coordination, and also is important for maintaining posture. When people drink a lot of alcohol actually has a lot of effects on the cerebellum, and that's why people tend to get a little stumbly and a little out of balance when they drink, and that's because alcohol is affecting your cerebellum. Cerebral palsy is a result of impairment of the cerebellum, largely through lack of oxygen during birth. The thalamus and the hypothalamus are other important brain areas. The thalamus is a relay center. It basically receives a lot of sensory information from the brain, and it sends it where it needs to go. So if you're getting various types of sensory information, it all goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends it where in the brain it needs to go. The hypothalamus is really important for autonomic functions that help to maintain homeostasis, and that's like appetite, body temperature, water balance, also blood pressure. The limbic system is the scent of instinctive behavior and emotion. We're not going to really go into the specific structures of it, but you can see the limbic system here inside. Stimulation of various regions within this limbic system may elicit sensations. So, for example, we talked about cocaine a couple lectures ago. Cocaine actually has effects in the limbic system that make people feel good. And so that's one of the types of sensations that it's referring to. Cocaine has effects within the limbic system that releases dopamine and is largely thought to then make people feel good and happy. Same thing with eating a good meal. That also releases dopamine, and if you remember, dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain. Cerebral spinal fluid helps cushion the central nervous system. It's basically similar to blood plasma and interstitial fluid as far as what's inside of it. It's important. So your brain actually weighs about 3 pounds, but it helps to have it floating in cerebral spinal fluid so that your head always doesn't feel heavy. Hydrocephalus is a condition in children where the cerebral spinal fluid does not drain like it should into the bloodstream, and it causes an enlarged head. This is actually the end of lecture 4, and there is one more having to do with applications of what we've just talked about.